Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com. Before we get started, I have to introduce the Tam Tam du jour. This is a Pista brilliant, as you can see, symphonic gong, shined up and polished to create a glistening, gleaming surface, but also it has a high, somewhat splashy color, which actually, like so many Pista symphonic tam-tams, is not terribly good at low dynamic levels, but is wonderful when you want a big, loud, splashy thing. The sound in timbre is very metallic. Here, let me show you what I mean. Here we go. Listen to how long that thing reverberates. Pista gongs really hang on to the sound. And for that reason, they're difficult to use because the truth of the matter is sometimes they're rather slow to speak. Not this one. You get sound right away, which is good. But you got to stop them because what most people don't realize is even in music with like lots of whole notes and ties that go across the bar lines, you're really only talking about a few seconds. And after that, you're onto something else, and you don't want these things out there forever. But let me give you a louder example, because this is really quite something when it gets going. Ooh, yes, let's do it this way. Yes, I have to mute that a little bit, because if I don't, it will still be going a half hour from now. It's really kind of fascinating just how amazingly these things reverberate, and you can see the light here that's shining on it. It's really a beautiful instrument and wonderful at appropriate times for the right kind of music. Unfortunately, as I've so often pointed out, most conductors and percussionists, for that matter, really don't care and don't pay much attention to the actual quality of sound that a composer might have had in mind when writing specific parts. They take out the same old thing that they use for everything and they use it for everything. Nah, I never did that. That's why I have all these suckers. Anyway, so what are we talking about? Oh yeah, I remember. Thank you for joining me for that Tam Tam du jour episode. No, seriously. One of you had asked me to rant and rave, which of course is nothing I love doing more, about completing incomplete works. And I've done that. I've done that, for example, in my discussion of Mahler's 10th and Bruckner's 9th, but in a general sense, in a more general sense, and to probably toss out a few more examples. Let me just move this a little bit so I can, there we go, that's better. And so I said, yeah, what the heck? I mean, ranting is my specialty. Let's talk about why is it that people feel the necessity to complete incomplete works by great composers. Really, when you think about it, nothing is dumber, right? Stupid. Why? Why? Because great composers are geniuses, and the people who complete their work are just schlubs. It's that simple. They're just you and me, normal guys, not geniuses, hacks. The entire music industry has created a somewhat secondary subspecialty of people who try to earn a living completing other composers' music. And of course, if you have the ability to write in different composer styles, I mean, that can be fun. That's great. I mean, Peter Schickele, aka CPE Bach, that's CPE, PDQ Bach. CPE was real. PDQ Bach, he could write like anybody. I mean, it's fascinating, but he did it for the right reasons. That is, as a joke. He wasn't trying to be serious about writing other people's music, but these people are, and oh, it's a problem. But the fact of the matter is, in order to really make sense of this bizarre subspecialty, we need to consider each case as it comes. So I have a bunch of cases that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to start with a couple that we've discussed already and figure out why something is smart or why something is stupid. And we can decide for ourselves, or you can vote afterwards in the comments. Mahler 10. Here's the argument for completion. The argument for completion is that the work exists from beginning to end as a continuous thread of melody, often with some of the filling out and with several complete movements fully orchestrated. Now, I have no problem with the adagio and even the purgatorio, although I think some creative rescoring of the repeat of the purgatorio would be rather nice. I really do. But the fact of the matter is, Mahler finished them. And so there's no reason not to listen to them. It's just a question of editorial work to bang them into some kind of shape. But the second movement is still a little bit sketchy, although I think performable. The fourth movement is just a sketch. And the finale is problematic. Finales are always problematic, aren't they? You wish composers would write the finale first and then work backwards. That's what Mahler did with his third symphony. He wrote all the other movements and then wrote the first movement last. That was probably smart because that allowed him to create the correct cyclical form while he was going. In any case, with Mahler's 10th, the problem, it seems to me, twofold. First, the fourth movement. It's harmonically quite gnarly, and the orchestration needs to really snap and snarl and be very clean, and no one has successfully, in my view, orchestrated the thing yet. They've gotten bits of it right, but not the whole thing convincingly. That's a function of, the ability of the arranger, the faux Mahler person. I think the best by far is still Derek Cook because he was honest about what he's doing. All he said was, I tried to make the sketch performable in as close to a style that Mahler was sort of at when he died as I possibly could. And that is honest and sincere, and he did it for love, basically, which is the only reason to do these things. Then we have the finale. The problem with the finale is a problem we find with most of these soi-disant completions. The problem is this. It's not that we don't have enough to finish it. It's that it needs to be cut. We don't know what the final shape was going to be. Even though it's complete at that point. That doesn't mean complete for all time, especially when you're dealing with Mahler. Now, Mahler did not usually make huge structural changes once he had envisaged a movement. He had a very good sense of its shape. But this finale has a couple of issues. The biggest one is what happens after the big return of the string tune, the big lyrical, passionate string tune. The whole coda is too long. And I suspect that had Mahler survived, he would have cut it. He would have done something. He would have found a way to get to that ending faster because it just lays there. Oh, it just lays there. And the other problem with the finale is the big climax with the return of the chord from hell and the opening theme of the adagio. The approach to it and the way out of it. No one has successfully resolved that either. I have some ideas, actually, about how it should go, and maybe someday I'll have a crack at it myself. But no one has successfully done it yet. And that makes the movement, which really ought to be the culmination of the whole work, it's going to be a finale symphony, that makes the whole thing kind of a letdown. So I'd rather just hear the bits that Mahler completed, because I know that there isn't anybody who's going to come along who's going to do what Mahler would have done. And I'm not interested in what anybody but Mahler would have done. So that's Mahler. Now we go to Bruckner 9, which I talked about in the Bruckner 9 chat as well. Oh, God, what a mess. What a god-awful, horrible mess. Okay, Bruckner intended that there be a finale. We know he intended that there be a finale. But the problem with Bruckner is very different than the problem with Mahler, because while Mahler did not make big structural changes, Bruckner did. Bruckner not only made structural changes in his symphonies, he'd replaced whole movements, he rewrote whole movements, and he often did not arrive at his final conception of a work until several revisions down the line, none of which happened. The Bruckner people say, well, he wrote most of it, and he did. He wrote most of it. It's mostly there in sketch or in full score, but he left out the coda, and we have to have the coda. Bullshit. The problem is not the coda. The problem is the entire movement. Bruckner codas are easy to do. You just pile everything up and combine all the themes from all the movements, and voila, instant Bruckner coda. That is not the problem. The problem is everything that happens leading up to the coda, because we don't know how Bruckner wanted the symphony to end. We just don't. And even if we know how he wanted it to end at the time that he died, that doesn't mean that's how he would have really wanted it to end ultimately. He might have decided that was all terrible and he had to fix it and start all over again. The fact of the matter is with the Bruckner Ninth Finale is that the thematic material is extremely weak. It's some of the most ugly and unappealing music he ever wrote. And the way that it's worked out formally, it's got the usual contrapuntal thing and the chorale thing. I find it completely unconvincing. And I really, really think that either he was feeble at the end, his mind wasn't working, it wasn't all there, or he just needed time. He needed time. He needed as much time as it was going to take, because the ninth has a very unusual shape for a Bruckner symphony. You have a big, huge first movement, and you have a big, huge finale, a big, huge adagio, pardon me. So was it going to be a finale symphony like the eighth, or was it going to be somewhat lighter like the seventh? It seems like it would have had to be a finale symphony, but we don't know that. Bruckner was a genius. The only thing you could say is when the genius does its thing and it works, it does genius things, and it will do whatever we don't expect. And to do what is expected is the biggest mistake one of these completion people can make. And that's all they do is what's expected, because they have to work with what they have, number one. And when they have to fill in, they want to fill in like something that we've already heard before. That's how we know it sounds like Bruckner. And the whole thing is a big, fat waste of time. So that's my take on Bruckner's ninth. And again, we see the same thing. The fact is, a genius is a genius. You cannot substitute for the uniqueness of what a genius is going to do. And you particularly cannot come up through musicology, through arid technical study and whatnot, with strokes of genius, the flame of inspiration, the thing that's going to say, aha, that's a masterpiece. It's not. It's just not. So that's Bruckner's ninth. Now, let's work our way back a bit to another one. Not back, actually, this is forward. Pardon me. But it's in a different realm entirely. Puccini's Turandot. Now, Puccini's Turandot is a fascinating study. Why? Because everyone agrees that the completion is horrible, but everybody plays it anyway, and we put up with it. And the reason we put up with it is because it's an opera. It's got a story. We know what the ending is supposed to be. Everybody wants to hear them sing the ending. I mean, Puccini died fascinatingly with half of the finale completely done, and with the most important scenes completely orchestrated and done, complete. And then there are some sketches for what happens after the death of Liu. But it's a completely clean break. It's really kind of fascinating because he got stuck. He didn't know how to finish it. And if he didn't know how to finish it, how the hell was Franco Alfano going to know how to finish it? I mean, it's just terrible. I remember the first time I heard that completion, I was just actually not paying attention. I was reading a book. It was the Leinsdorf recording with Jussi Björling and Birgit Nilsson. And Liu had just bit the big one and kicked the bucket. It's Renata Tebaldi, I think. And all of a sudden the music starts up again, and I sat bolt upright and I just said, whoa, that's not Puccini. I mean, that's how obvious the break is. It's just dreadful. But the real problem with this conclusion begins with the libretto itself, because it's hopeless. It's completely unbelievable. And I know you're saying it's unbelievable. It's an opera. Operas aren't believable. That's not what I mean. What I mean is opera composers, no matter how stupid the plots that they deal with and how terrible the prose that they set, have to believe in the emotional truth of what they're doing. The emotional situations have to be believable. That's what makes the thing work. No matter how silly the situation, the characters are real. What they do and how they feel makes sense given the situation. And that libretto makes no sense at all. None. Zero. I mean, she's supposed to guess Kaloff's name. First of all, they're the two most unsympathetic characters in all of opera. He's an egomaniacal jackass who's besotted with Turandot, no matter what, and doesn't give a damn about the fact that Liu has just stabbed herself. I mean, everyone else is mourning Liu, and he's like, poof. I mean, he makes some gestures in that direction, like, oh, poor you. Now, as I was saying, I want you, Turandot. And she, of course, is, a witch. I mean, she's just horrible. She's glacial and icy. And Puccini wanted to melt her into a willing, warm, loving woman. Well, that wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen at all. And it doesn't happen just because at the very end, when the emperor says, what's his name? She says his name is Amor. And everybody goes, Amor. And then they all recapitulate Nessun Dorma. That doesn't do it. That doesn't do it at all. In fact, I would start, if I were doing the ending of Turandot, by changing the whole libretto. I would totally redo the libretto. I mean, if they want to get married, that's fine. I don't care. But there are only two realistic endings to Turandot. Liu dies, the population rises up and slaughters Turandot and Kalof. That way you get through the ending in 5 minutes, which I think would be perfect. There's just this huge uprising and it ends in chaos and they get killed. Or I think the best way to end it would be to go back to Ping, Pang, and Pong, the Commedia dell'arte characters. I think they should have the prince and Turandot get back together and they could embrace and go, and then these three guys come up very, very cynically and say, Principessa, we quit, and they leave. Or they do something in front of the curtain where they talk to the audience and say, do you believe that? Come on. Craziness. Silly. That would work. And the ending could be quiet. It should be a quiet ending. Why should it be a quiet ending? Because there is no way you can make an ending that is louder and more bombastic and more vulgar than the end of the second act. When they're all praising the emperor and it's got offstage brass and you've got the organ clanking along and tam-tam rolls. Yeah, like this kind. Fabulous. If you're going to do that, there's no way you can do more at the end of the opera. And I think the ending would have probably been a quiet ending. But you'd have to figure out how to do it and make that work. You could make it work if the characters were believable. But of course they're not. It'd be like the ending of Aida, where you have a quiet ending with two characters. They're in love and it's very sad and everybody feels what they're feeling. It works, right? I don't know how Puccini could do that with two ogres like Kalof and Turandot. But the ending of Turandot is just a disaster. But we do it because the libretto exists. And we know what Puccini intended to set. And it does end everything, however unsatisfactorily from a emotional and plot point of view. And so Franco Alfano did it, and we put up with it. And everyone knows it sucks. And we just put up with it, even though it sucks. And I like that. I like the fact that, okay, we listen to it, but we all know it sucks. That makes me happy because there's a jolt of honesty and sense. And then there's another one that I wanted to talk about, actually, which is also not going back. It's going forward even more. But I don't have to do this in order. It doesn't matter. Elgar's Third Symphony. Anthony Payne's grotesque faux Elgar. Now, Elgar is problematic anyway. He's problematic as a symphonist. Not everybody thinks his symphonies are the greatest thing since sliced bread, if you're not in England. The sketches for the Third Symphony are terribly sketchy, and I just think that what Payne wrote is Anthony Payne faking Elgar. It doesn't sound like Elgar. It doesn't have any particular attractive anything that I've noticed. It is the classic case of a non-genius faking being a genius, and boy, does it not work. Oh, God, it's just horrible. There's also an Elgar piano concerto, which is even worse. It's unbelievable what happens with these composers who leave sketches. That's why Brahms destroyed his. He was such a smart guy. Do not leave sketches. It's a mistake if you care about your reputation. In fact, I have a very, very funny story that I need to tell you that I've mentioned before here, I think. I was having lunch with the late, great Finnish composer Eino Juhani Rautavaara, and he was talking about what he was working on, his possible projects. And I said to him, are you planning on writing any more symphonies? And he's like, nah, I've had it with symphonies. I've done 8 of them. It's enough. And I said, well, listen, this is what you do. You don't actually have to write any. you just make some sketches. Just write Symphony number 9, Symphony number 10, Symphony number 11, make a few notations, throw them in a box, and forget about them. And just forget about them, because that way what will happen is, after you're gone, the Department of Rautavaara Studies at Helsinki University will go to work on your sketches and produce symphonies 9 through 57, as many as you want. I mean, you don't have to be alive to compose. I mean, sometimes it's better if you're not. You give other people something to do. Let them have a turn. And they can do it all under your name, doing whatever they damn well please, and there'll be a whole industry churning out Rautavaara symphonies. It's very much like the book business. I mean, you may recall, there are dead authors who are still writing books. One of the most famous, actually, I knew her agent was V.C. Andrews. Remember V.C. Andrews? She wrote trashy sort of supermarket, Harlequin romance, love and sex for housewife type books. Lots of them. And V.C. Andrews has been dead for decades. V.C. Andrews keeps publishing. V.C. Andrews keeps publishing because ghostwriters publish things under V.C. Andrews' name. The estate hires people to keep things going. And I actually had a terrible experience that was saved by the V.C. Andrews estate. I owe them terribly. What happened was, when I wrote my first book, it was called Beethoven or Bust. It was one of these guide to classical music type books. I was 25. I didn't know what I was doing in terms of like the publishing industry. And the publishing industry still existed back then, unlike now, when books are, sort of on the way out with digital media and print on demand and all that. They actually paid good money for a book. And what happened was, I sold the book and got a very, very hefty advance. I sold it to, I think it was Prentice Hall. And they were publishing the book as something called the Prentice Hall Good Music Guide, but they had some sort of issue with their trade paperback division, and they closed it down. And they told the editor of this series to get their money back. So the editor hired his like mother, actually, I think it was, or his mother-in-law, something like that. It was like a local music teacher somewhere in the city, to trash my book and say that it was unpublishable because it was musically incorrect and incompetent. And it was a horrible, heartbreaking, terrible, terrible moment. It was just awful. And they were threatening to sue me unless I gave them the money back. And it was multiple thousands of dollars that I didn't have, that I'd spent, unless I gave them the money back. And then they were not going to publish the book. Well, it was just terrible, absolutely terrible. And I didn't know what to do, but I had a good agent, and she was the agent for V.C. Andrews. And V.C. Andrews was in turn published by, I think it was Prentice Hall at the time. I may be wrong with all this. This is my memory working here. But she called them up and she said, if you don't want me to take V.C. Andrews' business elsewhere, you will leave him alone. And, I had to write a big defense of the book, and of course everything was factually correct. I'm not an idiot that way. I didn't try and sell them something phony, but that was how it went. And so they simply let me keep the advance, and I placed the book someplace else, and that was that. And the rest is history. And my first book was published finally. But that was really, really an event. But that's what happens in publishing all the time. You have ghostwriters. Well, now the classical music industry is doing the same thing. It has ghost composers. And I told Rautavaara, just, don't worry about death. It's only the beginning of your publishing career as a composer. And that's what the Elgar Third is. It's simply a ghost-written piece of no quality. It has just about as much quality as a Harlequin romance from a literary point of view. It's just awful. Absolutely awful. So, that's that. Let's now actually go back in time a bit. Let's talk about Schubert. Now, Schubert wrote all kinds of partial symphonies and other things and left tons of stuff incomplete, and all kinds of people have completed things from piano sonatas to the unfinished symphony. The unfinished symphony is actually a very interesting case, because the unfinished symphony has the first few bars of a scherzo, a third movement, which you can work out. And then there's tons of miscellaneous Schubert laying around that you can get a trio from and orchestrate and stick it in there. And for the finale, everybody picks one of the entr'actes, the B minor, the same key as the symphony, from the Rosamunde incidental music, which works perfectly well. So you can actually get away with completing the unfinished symphony. The reason it's so stupid is that no matter what you do, what you complete either is something that you've mostly invented yourself, or it's something else that Schubert wrote for something else. There's no reason it has any business with the unfinished symphony. You can listen to the Rosamunde music separately. You can play the entr'acte from Rosamunde at the end of the unfinished symphony and do your own completion. What difference does it make? There's no logical reason why any of these bits that you add on to it have any right to be there or any necessity to be there. It's just a waste of time. I mean, a similar waste of time is, remember Beethoven's 10th? That thing? That doesn't sound anything like anything by anybody. I mean, we don't have to talk about it any more than that. It's just a complete waste of time. But one of the other sort of incomplete masterpiece things that we need to discuss is Mozart's Requiem. Now, Mozart's Requiem, as you know, was completed by his pupil Süssmayr, and everyone has been crapping on Süssmayr's completion ever since. But Süssmayr's completion has one thing going for it, and that's this. Mozart was still writing in what we call a common practice period. That is, there was a general style of writing that most composers adhered to. Now, the difference between that general style and a work of genius is subtle. It's subtle. You can get away with faking Mozart much, much more easily than you could get away with faking like Bruckner or Mahler. Because if you wrote in that classical style, then a lot of what Mozart did was, normal stuff in that style. And then there were the things that had elements of genius and inspiration that make it uniquely Mozart. So it's conceivable that in the Mozart Requiem, if you have enough bits that are uniquely Mozart, you could do the rest in the general classical style, and it might not be his greatest work, but it would be pretty acceptable. And that's basically what Süssmayr did. See, Mozart wasn't a very good composer of sacred music anyway. He didn't like it. He didn't respond to it. I mean, he had absolutely nothing spiritual in his character whatsoever, nothing at all. And I think that most of the worst parts of the Requiem are actually the parts that are by Mozart. Like I mentioned it, that incredibly stupid trombone solo in the tuba miram. Oh my God, it's ridiculous. It's such a silly passage, and that's by Mozart. That's in the original. Süssmayr didn't make it up. I thought he did. I thought it was so absurd that someone else must have stuck it in there, somebody with no taste. But it was actually Mozart. And so I'm not fond of the Requiem anyway, because I don't think it contains Mozart's best music, even the parts that are Mozart. I think it's patchy. I think it happens in small sniglets. I don't think there's any bigness of vision, which you always have in late Mozart. But it gets the job done. And of course, it has such a cachet because, he was dying and it was, tuberculosis, and it was in the movie Amadeus. And, there's all that non-musical biographical falderall that people would much rather think about than actually listen to the music and say, well, maybe it's not very good. But, it's much more fun to think about all the other, contingent circumstances than to actually have to confront what Mozart actually did or what he actually wrote. What's even worse than the Requiem is the C minor Mass. That's a real mess because people are completing that now based on what Mozart didn't write at all. They're just making things up as they go along. I mean, the completion of the C minor Mass, it would have been Mozart's greatest sacred work. No question about it. But he didn't finish it. He lost interest. It wasn't his thing. And I'm more than happy to leave it that way. When a composer is enormously prolific, I mean, when he writes lots and lots of music, excuse me, got an itch there. When a composer is really prolific and writes tons of music, do we really need to have ton plus one? Is it necessary? Why can't we be happy with what there is that the composer actually did and celebrate that? That's really my question. I remember there was a very interesting musicological seminar I was at, and I think it was in Edinburgh, and it was really very, very interesting. They were talking about completions, and they were talking about Schubert completions, in fact, and one of the works that everybody thought was quite successful, which is very, very different than a lot of these other completions, was Rendering by Berio. And the reason it was successful is because Berio clearly differentiates that which is the original composer and that which he adds. And the result is a completely unique fusion. It's not just Schubert, it's Berio's Schubert. That's interesting. That is a new take on the piece as a work of art. And it's a collage. It incorporates things from elsewhere, which of course Berio is better at than anybody in the world, as we know from his Symphonia. So there's wonderful, wonderful stuff that you can do to put your own take, put your own slant on the work of another composer without pretending to be that composer. And that's really where things get very, very iffy, in my view. I just am more than happy to live with what we have. And there's value in scarcity. If you start churning out this stuff, by the ream, by the ton, then it devalues the genius. It devalues everything about it. What makes this stuff special is that it's limited in quantity, but superb in quality. If it's no longer limited in quantity and quality is no longer a consideration, you get mediocrity. And I think we're all here because we prefer to listen to the good stuff. We're not interested in mediocrity. But I haven't heard any of these completions that get beyond the mediocre. I mean, really, really mediocre. Some of them are interesting. Some of them are nice to have, once in a while as sort of a musicological essay or as a curiosity. But you have to be clear on what you're listening to. It is not the guy. And that's important because we have an obligation to ourselves as people who are trying to understand and appreciate great music, great works of art, to have some vague view of what makes them so great. And what makes them so great cannot be what Schlockmeister B does to finish the incomplete whatever the hell it is. So that's the rant. I do not like completions as a rule. I am more than happy to leave things where the composers left them. And, if somebody comes up with something which is in its own way evidence of genius, I'll celebrate it when I hear it. Every case has its own individual pluses and minuses. But so far, the minuses seem to be winning big time. Really big time. So, keep on listening. See? I completed my own incomplete video. Wasn't that meaningful? Take care.